from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
We are most pleased to bring you a 2-week series discussing, first of all, diversity and multiculturalism in higher education. And we're going to look at some demographic, what's going on here in the Pacific Northwest as well as around the United States. Next week on the program, we will move into community discussion of those same issues of diversity and multiculturalism, how our society is changing and how we're becoming more a diverse society, and how individuals and organizations and groups can work together within their communities with harmony and celebration. In order to carry out these two programs, we're most fortunate to have as our guest, both this week and next week, Mr. William S. Ponder. He presently serves as the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Services at Eastern Washington University in Cheney, Washington. He's also held positions in Western Washington and California, and he comes to us with great credentials to discuss this issue. I would also like to introduce his academic background. He holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's of Science or actually I should say from San Diego State University. He also in 1998 was at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education in the MDP program. He presently serves on the advisory board of Higher Education Institute of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. Mr. Ponder, it's a pleasure having you on the program. You're generous to give us this much time, and we thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Tony.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and I shall ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to have you here. May I call you Bill?
Sure, that's fine.
You're very involved in enrollment activities at Eastern Washington University over at Cheney, and probably in Spokane as well. Can you tell us something about the demographics of the population at one of our inland Northwest institutions of higher education?
Well, speaking about Eastern, which is where I'm at this point in time, it's been pretty interesting. Over the last few years, the enrollment of both students of color at Eastern has always been relatively good. It's been interesting because the last couple of years, both WSU and the UW and Central and Western have all seen declines in enrollment. And some question about that in terms of are those students reacting to Initiative 200 in terms of not being able to get access to higher ed in those institutions. We've had a pretty interesting situation, I think, in the last year or so where the historically black colleges have decided to move up their recruitment and been much more aggressive to come in and talk to some of our better students and providing those students with opportunities outside of the state, which I think is a concern. I've always been concerned about that because it really presents kind of a brain drain for us. I mean, if we lose some of our top students to those institutions, because generally what happens if a student leaves the state, they have a hard time, figuring out that it'd be good for them to come back. So that I think that's in some ways what's been happening here, at least in the state of Washington.
Well, recognizing that our viewers are all over the area, but
Right.
Let's talk about Washington just for a minute. What are the groups that comprise the students that you're talking about?
Well, I think we've seen the largest increase with Chicano Latino students and Asian Pacific Islander students. Both the African American population and the Native American population have stayed relatively flat, although the African American population has grown also. But those two that I mentioned earlier are the two significant. I may want to mention that it'll be interesting to see what happens with the census, 2000 census, in that over the last less than 10 years that we've seen significant increases in those two populations. The Chicano Latino population in the state has risen about 100,000 from the early 1990s.
How would this compare with an institution in another state? Let's just pick out a Midwestern state or a state more centrally located.
Well, you find that I think in certain central parts of the United States, some similarities in terms of the growth, but not the type of growth that you would see in terms of the student of color populations. Some of those institutions have increased their populations relatively in those numbers, but nothing that would compare to what's happening on the west coast of the United States. We are this part of the country where the significant growth of individuals is going to be, period, but also specifically when we talk about students of color.
Now, I might be putting you on the spot a little bit, so tell me if you don't know the answer to this question, but there is a certain percentage of students who are Caucasian who go on into higher education.
Right.
What kind of percentages are there of, say, for example, Latinos, Chicanos?
In terms of just this part of the country or the United States?
Let's talk about the United States as a whole,
as
maybe,
a whole.
Because I think what we're going to find is a great disparity.
Yeah.
Or we can talk about this part of the country.
You're right. There is a great disparity. The overall percentages in terms of those students that go on to higher education in both the Chicano Latino population and the African American population still hover right around 50% or that around that in terms of percentage. It's interesting that even though the numbers who have graduated from high school in both of those populations are up around 80 or 90%, the percentage of those students that do move on to higher education still is I believe, relatively low.
So what we're saying is that as an overall of their population comparatively, for the number graduating from high school, the number graduating from high school, going on to higher education is markedly less than if it were a Caucasian student.
Yeah, and you find that some of that, I know that looking at it nationally, some of what is contributed to that is that some of it deals with the low preparation in the schools that they attend. Those students, some of which are not able to get the college preparatory courses, or they have a difficulty in terms of getting through those courses, in terms of the kinds of support that one would find. The other is of course, the financial piece and the funding of going to college. And if they're the first in their household or first generation, then that funding piece becomes pretty critical to that too. And sometimes that is what keeps them from moving on.
There's so many questions to ask you, and to take advantage of your great expertise and understanding. I think I'm going to use Idaho and Washington for a little while, and then move back to the national scale. When you look at Eastern Washington, you indicated Washington State University and Eastern Washington University, and then you go over onto the coast where you have the large institution, University of Washington, and other colleges. What is the comparison of the demographics that make up of the student body? Obviously, we know that in the general population that Western Washington is reflecting a very different makeup than Eastern.
Right. The Western part is much more diverse in terms of the populations within those institutions. UW and Western have much more larger percentages of students of color and much more diverse populations. Part of that is because of where I think they're located in very large metropolitan area where you have larger numbers of individuals who've in-migrated into the state, and also those individuals who've come from other parts of the world. But it's interesting, along with that, though, that the eastern part of the state has started to see some significant change. I mean, we mentioned earlier the situation about the Central Valley and the significance of the growth in the Chicano Latino population in the Central Valley. And I think a significant increase in terms of the Asian Pacific population in the greater Spokane area. I mean, gathering the information that we do, because we have to look at that in terms of enrollment and who the students are, what the population looks like. It's been pretty interesting to see that a shift. Although it's been very small shift, but it's start to see that shift in terms of the population. And I suspect as the baby boom echo, that second group that comes along here, and it's starting to come along, I think once we see that group becoming a significant impact in terms of higher education access, going on to higher education, we'll see that some of that's going to be reflective in the population of students that we have. The example of that is the largest increase of students of color at Eastern was Asian Pacific Islander students this year. Something
that's very significant in this whole process, both here in our region and also in the nation, as the demographics have changed in the student body, have we seen the similar kind of change in the composition of faculty and administrators, because obviously it is very, very helpful to have on staff a diversity too, so you have that same kind of communication that takes place in the student body. What do you find there, Bill?
It's interesting, Tony. The change in terms of administration and faculty has not kept pace with the situation with students. I think most of us who have been in higher education for a number of years have pretty well seen that that has been the case nationally. Although it's interesting because now, during this time, there is a great shift of retirements. A huge number of faculty and administrators who started working in the early 60s are now retiring. At Eastern and at a number of other places, a third of the faculty over the next 5 years will retire. So there are a number of opportunities here, and I'm hoping that institutions take that opportunity to have their faculty and administration be more reflective of the student body, because they're going to have some real good opportunities to do that.
And that's real crucial, because there's certain periods in which you do not have many retirements. Same is true here at this institution or the college. In the late 1960s, early 70s, there was a real increase in hiring and expansion.
Right.
And so again, we're having the same thing, retirements coming up.
Right.
I want to get another area that's of real importance to me, and that is through the affirmative action process, going back many years ago, both in the colleges and in the workplace, how it has affected women, for example, and also minority communities. Again, you may want to use some statistics, but we saw a very significant increase in enrollment in institutions, both of women and minority students, based on what I would contend is a very successful application of affirmative action. Now with not only the vote in Washington, but also in California and some policies in Texas. Am I not correct when I understand that there's also in some of those states a decrease, that by weakening affirmative action, you're creating a student body that's not as diverse?
Yeah, you're right. And it's interesting that because some of those who were opponents of that were based on not only in terms of the way how successful those programs had been previously, but the psychological impact on the community that has, I think, even made the situation, I think, in some ways worse. You found in California, for example, when 209 came in, that both the University of California and the California State University System, which are the two large public institutions in that state, were having very difficult times being able to even go into the community and talk about the benefits of going on to higher ed. That community people saw that the university had turned their backs on them because, as you mentioned earlier, in previous years, the whole outreach effort, the whole recruitment effort was very, very successful. And there were generations of students that came in through those particular programs that graduated and went back into the community and were really helpful in helping us to recruit students. I was in California in the early 80s when I felt we did an excellent job of talking about the benefits. And I felt we were welcomed into the community to do that. And I know that my colleagues now in California are having a difficult time. It's a struggle for them, on the one hand, to recruit those students, but also to have the same level of acceptance from the community to be able to come in and talk about the benefits of going on to higher ed. I think the same situation we'll find and have found, I think, here in the state of Washington too. Those individuals who have been, who've really been very successful in doing that are having some of the same difficulties.
So these particular votes and policies through the initiatives and so forth are sending a message, and it's impacting the community. Yeah,
you're right. It is, and it's very difficult, I think, to go into a community and talk about the fact that you work for a public institution and that institution is open, has open access to everyone, and to have those individuals in the community say, well, it's open access, but now that you have this particular, initiative and law in place, how do we then still have the same kind of access that we had before?
One more question before I return to Janelle.
Sure.
That is, in those particular states that we've identified, such as Texas and California and Washington, are you also seeing, now that those debates and votes have taken place that a number of students are exiting from those states to go to school somewhere else.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier the situation I think in Washington here, where the historically black colleges have been very aggressive in terms of coming in and talking to our better students. And one of the things I think the community really doesn't realize is that, you know, those institutions are very, they see an opportunity here. And that's a great opportunity because we have some very, very good, very, very talented students. And so for them to come in and offer that student a full ride scholarship, you know, to those institutions is really does affect, I think, our overall community, because those are future leaders, those are future business people, those are future civic people that I think are critical for the communities that we have to be successful, and also to be a part of helping this state and this region of the United States to deal with those issues and to be successful in terms of the things that we need to look at in the future. So we're having a situation where we're gonna feel the impact of that 5 or 10 years down the road as these individuals leave the state and they don't return, in terms of what's happening with our leadership within the community. So I think it's very, I think people are not aware of that to a certain extent. I think they should when they look at this.
Thank you. Yeah.
In this round of questioning, I'd like to ask you about the reason to have a diverse population. Why, if our area has a certain demographic population, is that not good enough, so to speak, for the institutions of higher education in the area?
Well, I think a lot of times there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that diversity is good because it exposes individuals to a variety of ways of thinking and a variety of cultural views about different things in the world. And I believe that, you know, an educated person should be a person of the world. I mean, I believe that person should have the ability to be able to move within various cultures, within various communities, and to be effective doing that. I think you have to have a certain skill level, and I think you have to have a certain understanding, and I think you have to be able to interact with a variety of people to be, I think, an educated person, a worldly educated person, I think. And so I think that's critical. The second is a pragmatic one, and one that's, I think, very, very real, that the majority of our students now who graduate and go on and move into the business world or move into the community world are dealing with a much different community than even you or I may have started off in our lives with. Much, much different community. And I see that for us not to be able to help them, to be able to look at that and be able to move within that community and to be an effective leader, person who's I think provides the types of things to the community is really, really kind of disservice. I think we are providing a disservice if our students aren't able to do that and able to do it well, not only here within the Pacific Northwest, but I think throughout the world.
Now, when you go out then to get students, there's a competitiveness about getting students.
Sure. Yeah.
And what is it that you can offer to students that you need to be able to offer to students? And of course, the flip side of that coin is, if you're a student, what should you be looking for in that institution that you go to? Yeah,
I think that's a great question, because I think there are several. One is that I think students now have to, and parents too, have to look at not only the benefit of higher education as a means to a job, but how does that education create in a person the understanding that there is what I call a civic responsibility. It's really interesting. There's been a lot of discussion in the last decade about, should we have character education in higher ed? Should we have civic responsibility in higher education? And my belief has always been that should be part of it, and that in some ways we've maybe gotten away from that, and hopefully we'll come back to it. But I think that's critical. I think along with the other things that most institutions offer, at Eastern we offer the liberal arts, and we offer specific majors geared towards the sciences and engineering and those things. I think the other is that we offer a sense of community. And I think that's really important, because I know that for my own education, one of the things that I most appreciate was a sense of community, that there were individuals who cared for my welfare, not only as a student, but as a human being. And I think that's what I would hope most institutions provide, along with the educational piece. And we all provide, I think, the same types of things when we talk about that. I mean, I think we all have those organizations within the university and the colleges that provide some of that. But it's a unique fit, I think, for students. And I think parents and students need to look at that. They need to see where their child's fits within that community.
You really caused me to think of something else that I want to ask, and that's what a great guest does. In dealing with how we were talking about students moving into certain states where on particular issues the state may be actually more friendly to dealing with certain policy-related institutions if they're not having certain initiatives and votes. I think of that in the terms in the long run. Would you like to comment on the question, will some states in America realize somewhat a different life in the 21st century than others, that if they are really recruiting and encouraging diversity, and as we are a global market, we're never going back to isolation. Will we find in the future that some states, what one might use a value judgment and say, will have a much more wise policy in how they're going to cope with issues in the world compared with some other states?
Yeah, and I think you've kind of seen some of that already. It's interesting, the approach in Florida, where the governor there did not want Ward Connolly to come in, and made some significant changes in terms of how he's approached the public institutions there in that state in terms of looking at the whole affirmative action situation. I think you'll find, and it's been interesting, looking at states like Arizona and New Mexico, where you haven't heard of the same type of initiative, where there are significant Chicano and Latino populations there. And I mean, there are, I think, certain states that will look upon this and really see that there will be more opportunity for them as a state in terms of approaching this differently, and that they will have the richness of diversity that will help them not only in terms of the economic piece, but also, I think, as a community. So I firmly believe that some of those, Tony, are happening already, and I think that some policymakers are consciously thinking about that in terms of how they're approaching it.
And some corporations, larger corporations and CEOs are very tuned into what you're talking about.
Right.
There's a number of CEOs that are working with their workforce to, one, diversify it and to have training in that process with awareness that they're going to be trading all over the world. And secondly, are they also communicating with universities to try to build this bridge between the education and those more progressive corporations?
Yes, they are. And I think they're looking for individuals, graduates, who possess, I think, different skill sets besides just the ones that normal corporations look at in terms of their technical skills, and to be able to communicate on various levels with various communities and individuals, to have that kind of that worldly kind of perspective. Now, it's real common now that for corporations to seek individuals who are not only bilingual but are trilingual or can speak more than 3 or 4 languages, because they find that person then can work within the business world internationally with very little problem. Ease into it.
Another question. This is some feedback I had from some students at universities around the country, and because of some of these things that have been happening that you've addressed concerning some policies in some states which are leading actually to less diversity, that it's affected students on campus, that there's been organizations of different student groups on campus, that there's been more challenge to have cooperation between them. So is that creating some isolation within the campus from a psychological viewpoint that's caused this to come about?
I think some of that has created that. It's, you see, I think, in some institutions in terms of that the climate, where students who normally may have had much more of a kind of a view about aligning themselves with other student groups now are kind of backing off a little bit and looking at, well, what's it, how is this going to fit into what we're doing, as opposed to looking at a more cooperative approach in terms of of working together. So I think you've seen some of that. I think some of what's happened also is sort of in some ways a natural reaction. I mean, there are certain individual groups who really kind of look at this and say, well, if the institution or the other parts of the community aren't supportive of us, then we have to kind of coalesce, and we just kind of back up a little bit, and we kind of, we sort of, circle the wagons a little bit, and we see what happens, and we will react based on what we perceive to be as an environment that's either hostile or an environment that's very supportive. So I think you've sort of seen that throughout the country.
We're real short on time. We don't have time to go back to the panel, but just one other quick question in the short time we have left. So these policies and the psychological impact is affecting on the campus, off the campus, within business and so forth. And so I hear you saying that there is a very important impact.
Very important impact. And I think policymakers and others who have been involved in this, I don't know that they really have looked at the fact that I think psychologically those types of things have made a significant impact on those groups of students.
On that note, I want to thank you, William S. Ponder, the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Services at Eastern Washington University. It's been a very informative program. You've helped us so much understand the development, what's going on this issue on the campus of higher education. And we want to invite you back next week, and I know you've agreed to come back, and when you do, we're going to talk about moving into the community and dealing with demographics, and two, how that is impacting in the Pacific Northwest, but also we will compare that with other regions in the country. And I know Janelle Burke joins me along with our staff, and thanking you for being with us today. And the good news is that you will be back next week, and we'll do part 2 of this series on the change in demographics of our population and diversity and what it means to our future and our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know that you have found this program both informative and helpful to you, and we thank you for joining us this week. And as I've indicated, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week when our guest will be William Ponder to talk about what is happening in communities around our country, addressing the question of diversity and how we're changing its population with our growth and the global aspects of who we are and where we will be in the 21st century. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum. The North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
I am pleased to welcome you back to our second program with William S. Ponder. He was with us last week, and we talked about a lot of demographics of student enrollment in higher education, what's going on around the United States and here in the Pacific Northwest, and the diversity and how it's developing in higher education. On the program this week, we're going to extend that from the higher education institutions to the general communities around America, look at some demographics, what's going on, and the changes that's taking place in our country, and the increase in diversity, and what that means to the global world in which we live. Our guest, as I've indicated, is William S. Ponder. He is the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Services at Eastern Washington University. Our guest comes to us with great experience in other institutions in Western Washington, California, prior to his work at Eastern Washington University. Our guest holds a baccalaureate degree and a master's degree from San Diego State University. He also, in 1998, was at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. He serves on the advisory board of the Higher Education Institute in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. Mr. Ponder, it was a pleasure having you here last week, and very informative program. We equally look forward to the discussion of our communities this week.
It's a pleasure being here, Tony. Great.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho. We shall invite Janelle to start our questioning with our guest, Mr. Ponder.
Bill, our discussion last week was really very interesting with regard to demographics. And I want to start right off with a question this week about demographics in our area. Washington, Idaho, realizing that that encompasses maybe the whole region because we have viewers in many different areas. But what are the demographics presently like, and how can we expect those to shift in the future?
Well, I think there are several indicators that demographically that kind of point out some things that we talked about last week. One is that during the last decade, or not quite decade, we've seen an overall increase, I think, within the region of about 16 or 17% in terms of overall population growth. And of that, probably 8 to 10% of that is people of color. An example of that is, I think we mentioned this last week about the Chicano Latino population in the state of Washington has grown from 1990 to 1998 by about a plus 100,000 people. And that's kind of just one little indicator that shows that there is this kind of shift now in terms of the, not only in terms of the groups of people that are moving in, but that they're moving in over a period of time in quite large numbers. The next group is the Asian Pacific Islander group, and that group has increased to probably a plus 150,000 or so. And then the next is the African American population, which has grown about 50,000 or so within the last decade. So it's been pretty interesting. I think it has taken maybe in some ways some people by surprise, because I think a lot of people think of Pacific Northwest and they think, well, there isn't that type of diversity, but there is, and it's moving. It's starting to move into, I think, the fabric of the community here.
What are some of the things specifically that you can see when you begin to have this diverse cultural experience? What are some of the things that you can begin to see? What are some of the issues that now arise? For example, bilingualism.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening? Are there more bilinguals?
There are I think a significant change in terms of the fact that you find that there are now more and more people having to look at the fact that there are larger numbers of people where English is not their first language, and that to be able to communicate with those communities, that those in the public sector, not only in terms of education but also public services, now have to take on the role of being able to communicate with those communities. And you find that they're now starting to look for individuals that do have the ability to speak more than one language, and they find that those individuals can deal with quite a bit of things that are happening. I'll give you an example. There is a community where there was a significant increase in the Hmong population, and the local police were unable to really communicate to this group of people some of the things that they felt that were important in terms of public safety. And the police department thought that it would be good if they were able to communicate with that group of folks. And so what they did is they actively went into the Hmong community and sought out individuals who they felt who could both be kind of interpreters, but also who could be involved in their public safety program. And we're able to find a number of individuals who wanted to do that, and who in their home countries were involved with public safety, and we're able to bring those groups, those individuals together, and have those individuals work with the community, and found that by doing that, it reduced a lot of the miscommunication. It really opened the community up, where a number of issues that were significant in that community were happening. We're able to communicate about those particular issues, and to really build a lot more trust with the police and those communities by doing that. So those are the types of things I think that are significant. They are significant, and I think we're going to have to, as a community, continue to look at ways of doing that, because I think that is going to be the future. I firmly believe that that is the future.
I'd like to build on Janelle's question in that area.
Yeah.
As communities, particularly in the state of Washington, and I do understand that would be true in Oregon too, in the Portland area and so forth. As those communities have grown in size and have become much more enriched with diversity in those populations, I guess I have a two-part question. How has that impacted, in addition to the example you just gave, within the religious community, within social events and gatherings? How are we changing in all aspects of what one would call the entire life of a community?
Well, I think you're finding now a much more, I think you're finding two things. One, you're finding the richness of those events. Now those events become much more engaging, because those communities now are participating and become participants. It's interesting. I was in Olympia, where I still live. My wife still lives here. We kind of commute back and forth here. Every year there's a parade, a community parade, and in the last couple of years, we've seen larger numbers of people of color participating in that parade, and from various communities. And some of those communities are communities that are in that area, but also some are from other areas, from Tacoma and Seattle. They come down to participate in this activity because there are people in the community who have invited them down. It's a very interesting dynamic when you have people who are living in the community and they invite those individuals who are part of their community to participate in those types of activities. So I think that's one. The second is that you start to have different conversations within the community about what is important. Some things around values, some things around the religious views of those communities, and some things that I think change some of the paradigm and some of the views about how we approach certain things. It's that I think is part of this whole shift, and will be a part of the shift, I think, as we go into the 21st century.
My second part of the question has to do with, as a community begin to change, or a community that has not yet had as much change, and they will in the future, I'd like to tap your expertise and say, how can a community actually come forth with a very important effort to say, how can we make the community more friendly for everyone? If we're talking about businesses, or we're talking about things that we can actually do. I was thinking of a conversation with a really wonderful person in Spokane, and she had made some suggestions dealing with businesses and the kind of products and so forth that one could provide in food services and so forth. What do we need to do that we have not yet done?
Well, I think those types of things are always very, very good to do, because then it says that the business is open to those communities. I think the other is that businesses can be involved in sponsoring activities, sponsoring organizations, being involved with those other communities out there that are starting to develop and are starting to grow. So I think that's really significant. I think the other is always in terms of hiring and other employment opportunities. I mean, when you have an opportunity to hire someone that brings in a different social, economic, or ethnic perspective, to be able to do that, because of the communities being, I think, relatively small, by that gesture, that person then is able to go back to the community and say, listen, this business really is open to a wide variety of people, and open to our community in terms of us supporting that business. So I think those are things. And then I think overall approaching the types of situations where, when something is negative in the community, that those businesses come out very strongly in terms of supporting the fact that we are one community, and that one community needs to be very, very vigilant about things that are detrimental to all of us. And I think that those are some things that businesses can do too. But I think there's others. Yeah.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
You've talked a little bit about the local region and in our area, but let's talk now about how the U.S. is going to look, or our country is going to look, and the world is going to look. Because all of us, even if we live here, are going to be doing some traveling.
Right.
We're going to be communicating with people in other areas. The world is getting smaller. What is the whole world going to look like?
Well, let's take the United States first, since that's where most of us will spend a lot of our time. There is a forecast, a demographic forecast, that puts us at really around 2025 as being a country that will be of no significant majority. What that means is that we will have probably pockets of parts of the country that may have significant populations of a certain ethnic or group of people, but that as a whole, the United States will be a nation where all of those specific ethnic groups, there will be no clear majority. And what that means is that for us to be able to govern, for us to be able to provide the civic responsibility that we need, for us to be able to enjoy the social and other civic responsibility that clearly we will have as a nation, the challenge to be able to work together. Clearly, the situation too is that there will be in the western part of the United States not only a significant change demographically, but also I think within the next 10 years you'll find that this part of the country will be where the majority of Americans will live. There's an interesting book about California that was written a number of years ago called The New California, and in the book, the first part of the book is a question, and the question basically says, how are you going to govern a state where there's going to be 50 million people? And it's a very interesting question because clearly California, at well over 30 million people at this point, is heading towards that 50 million. And it's a very, very interesting state in that now clearly there is a shift in the overall demographics within the state. I think that shift is going to create some out-migration to other states, Oregon, Washington, and other parts of the western part of the United States. But it's a very interesting piece because not only do we have the demographic shifts, but we also have the whole population shift where large percentage of people in this United States will be on this side of the Mississippi River.
And how do you get leadership now? You talked about some of the problems that are going to occur.
Right.
How do you get leadership then within these communities? If we have diverse communities, how do you grow up leadership, so to speak?
Well, I think there's two things. And one of the things that I'm very proud of is my work with Harvard with their Leadership Development Initiative. And one of the things that I think we're really looking at is that you have to approach it, one, from the long term run. I think it's one of identifying talent early and nurturing that talent so that it can then take on the responsibilities of leadership. And then secondly, I think identifying that the leaders of tomorrow have to be individuals that have a much more broader perspective on what leadership means, what that definition means, and how that definition works with various communities. I think the future leaders have to be those individuals who can, I think, bridge multiple layers of communities and multiple perspectives to be able to be effective. I think future leaders have to have those kinds of skills and those kinds of insights and have to be very comfortable moving within various communities at any given time and being very genuine in that, because I think communities are it's very easy for those people in the community to see whether or not you're genuine. It doesn't take much. They can tell.
This is always so helpful and informative. I want to go in another area to get your advice on it. In some communities, there is a struggle for what one would call for the soul of the community, and that is there are voices that rise from time to time, or often, unfortunately, with a message of hate. And you just briefly mentioned this in relation to another question I asked, and that is, how can a community in a solid way make sure that the diversity and the acceptance of the differences is heard and prevail? I guess part of my question is too, there's a debate goes on sometimes, if one remains silent, that those voices will disappear, and others say, no, that never happens that way. I'd just love to hear your advice to different communities that do face that question.
I think there seems to be two things. One is that how much of those voices, the negative voices, are reactionary to the perception that somehow things are not the way that they were previously. And it's always been interesting to me when those negative voices arise that they pretty much stay within several basic themes. They never move off of that. And so I think one of the things for communities to do is to look at how do they embrace and discuss and engage the total community in terms of looking at things that will benefit everyone. I mean, there are conversations and there are issues that are, I think, universal. Raising children, and safety, in the greater sense of the word safety. The economic piece, very, very critical in terms of talking about what unites us, I think, in terms of dealing with this. And so I tend to think that those negative voices, like I said, concentrating on just a few themes, and for people to look at that and see it for what it is, that it usually is only focused on one or two things, and that it doesn't represent all the issues that I think all of us see as being important in our community. And so if we concentrate on those things, those bigger things, the things that are most significant to all of us, that may be a way to approach some of that.
I'm thinking in relation to your answer that in the religious community in particular, where there are ecumenical councils and meetings and so forth, the religious community, I think, has learned a lot about how to share and to meet and to appreciate different discussions of theological matters. Can that same kind of format be used in some other arenas of the community?
I think so, and I think there needs to be, in some ways, I believe, more exposure to that. Tony, I'm a firm believer. I think there are more people out doing those types of things and engaging in those conversations, but we, and I'm saying collectively, as a community, we seemingly don't give those types of activities as much exposure. And so I think one of the other is that I believe that very strongly that somehow we need to kind of reevaluate the public media, the approach to the media in terms of those types of things, because I think that most people in the community will find that there are numbers of people doing those types of things, but we don't see those as significant. And I think part of it is that I think it really is one of values. I think we have to look at looking at those as being much more valuable things to report, much more valuable things to celebrate, much more valuable things to recognize as being things that benefit all of us in the community.
I know from what you're saying that the same kind of thing in recorded history has been the case, where we have omitted from history the contributions of so many segments of society. So what we've done in history, we find also often in the communities on a daily basis.
Exactly.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
I want to talk in this round of questions a little bit about the economic realities of what's going to be happening in the future. What is life going to be like? Is there going to be a group of people who are haves and have-nots? And how do we keep this from happening? What is the economic reality? How are businesses going to approach this whole question of diverse communities?
That is a very good question, because it's very significant. I believe that part of what you hear, the technical divide, the communities that will not have access to the internet, the limited kind of opportunities in terms of developing businesses. Some of that, I think, still permeates this country and the society. How much of that will there be in terms of how that's going to affect the society in the future? I'm not totally sure. Although I am cognizant of the fact that there are groups and organizations who see that if we don't close some of those gaps, that we will have a society where information, which I think is critical to a community being viable, may be limited. We may have a society where individuals don't see the view of civic pride that all of us have in terms of our communities, because there is that limited economic base. They can only feel that they can only get to a certain level, and that level is not going to help them get to the American dream. So there are those types of things I think that are still out there, and that, I think this country has a choice. I think we as individuals need to be very, very careful about making sure that as we continue to move into this next millennium, and as we continue to look at those issues, the technical divide, the economic divide, the social and civic divide, that there are opportunities for us to do things to close that, and that we need to be vigilant and continue to try to close those, because there are examples of countries throughout the world where those things are the norm, and you build a society around that norm, and people in that society expect that they won't have those opportunities. And we've seen that in other parts of the world where that becomes a part of civil unrest and creates, the types of situations which I don't think the people in this country would like to see.
A follow-up on that, and that is that, as you just mentioned, in some parts of the world where different ethnic and racial populations have not found living together as they should, and religion is an example in Ireland. With our country becoming one of the most diverse in the world, maybe the most diverse, as our President of the United States has indicated, he has said on a number of occasions that it is very crucial and important that we learn to appreciate the differences. I guess my question is going to be somewhat, as we're coming fairly close to the end of the program, a visionary one for you. What do you see as we move through the 21st century? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? What do you foresee that we should be very hopeful about, and what warnings are there?
Well, I believe I'm probably a pragmatic optimist. Maybe that's a way to.
That's a good term.
Yeah, pragmatic optimist. I believe that there are still great opportunities for us in this country and in the Pacific Northwest to have America reflect what I think most of us would like to see. However, along with that, I think that the pragmatic side of me says that there are some things that we as a society need to continue to support. We need to support a strong public educational system. We need to support a strong economic system that provides opportunities for everyone. And I think we need to support the idea that those of us who have an education have a civic responsibility. It's very important to me, this pragmatic approach, that those individuals coming out of our colleges and universities take on the civic responsibility that I believe, as an educated person, you need to do. So that's kind of the pragmatic optimist side of me. I think that as we continue to keep doing this, if we keep making sure that those things stay high on our priority, and that we make sure that our young people who come behind us, who are educated, take on the civic responsibility, then I have high hopes for this country.
That's very, very good to hear. Now, on the other side of the coin, what do you see as the sign that we need to be very concerned about?
Oh, I think definitely the technical divide piece is critical. I think we have communities, and not only in the urban areas, but I think in rural areas where technology still is not the norm, not the given. I think we're not reaching certain communities the way that we should, and I think that's going to create some problems for us, both socially and economically, if we don't close the gap. I think the other is, of course, the ongoing dialogue about race. W. Du Bois said, in the 20th century, the question will be about race. And I think in the 21st century, there are still some issues about race that the society needs to continue to address, both as an ongoing dialogue, which I believe it should be as an ongoing dialogue, and as individual people, because I think those are things that I think we still have to deal with.
That's a very important note. And on to close, and we're out of time, we thank you, William S. Ponder, for your 2 weeks with us. It's been most informative from Janelle Burke and the staff joining me in thanking you for giving us this time. We've learned a lot, and we thank you for helping us look towards the future and what communities should be like. Ladies and gentlemen, we've very much appreciated our guest, and we've been very happy to be in your home, our business over the past 2 weeks with this issue. And we know that you have found it informative, and we'd like to invite you to be with us again next week, and we'll move to yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America, and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.